Thanks so much, Brianna. Hey, thanks to all of you for being here today. We really appreciate it. Governor Inslee and I are here today to announce a lawsuit against the Trump administration over its plan to build a border wall by diverting billions of dollars lawfully appropriated for military construction projects. Those projects, we recently learned, now include an $89 million project, which Congress approved for Bangor Submarine Base right here in Washington State. So we just completed filing the lawsuit this morning in federal court. We filed it in the Western District of Washington, and that now has been filed. President Trump's emergency declaration is an unlawful and unconstitutional abuse of presidential power. This is unfortunately a part of a pattern with this administration, going back to our first Muslim travel ban case. As you may recall, in that case, the president argued in a briefing and before the federal courts that his action to execute the first Muslim travel ban was unreviewable by the federal courts. He literally was saying to the federal courts, you can't even look behind my decision making or why I'm doing this. Thankfully, the courts rejected that argument. Now he's trying to do an end around Congress to fund his border wall. The Constitution, as you know, gives Congress the power of the purse. In other words, the power to decide what the government pays for. Congress has repeatedly refused to provide additional funds for the border wall. President Trump's misuse of his presidential emergency powers to accomplish an ideological political goal is an egregious abuse of power that should concern all Americans, regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump or immigration issues. These are core constitutional issues that are at stake in this litigation. We're here to defend our laws, uphold our Constitution, and prevent the president from harming Washingtonians' economy and military families. I'm joined, of course, by Governor Jay Inslee. I just want to say these cases are always a team effort, and having the support of Governor Inslee, of his administration, of the resource of the administration is always a huge contribution to the cases that we bring. My legal team has been preparing for this litigation since the president first declared a national emergency, putting that in quotes, a national emergency, to build his long-promised border wall in February. I'd like to introduce some of the folks who are part of the team who are here today. My Solicitor General, Noah Purcell, Assistant Attorney General Andrew Hughes, Assistant Attorney General Brendan Selby. Not here today, unfortunately. A couple folks put a lot of time into the case but just could not be here. Martha Rodriguez Lopez, one of the attorneys in our office. Also Deputy Solicitor General Tara Heinz. A number of folks from our professional staff who have worked very hard in this case are here today, including paralegal Jenna Williams, paralegal Becca Davila Simmons, and legal assistant Morgan Mills. I say it all the time, but the decision to file a lawsuit is relatively straightforward. Putting together a complex lawsuit any lawsuit is time-consuming. A lawsuit against the President of the United States is, of course, especially complex and receives a lot of focus, and the team does an excellent job of putting these cases together, to put it very mildly. I'm also joined by John Timson, a Navy veteran and the legislative director of the Veterans Bar Association here in Washington State, whose presence here we appreciate and represents the harm President Trump is doing to our Navy. What we'll do is I'll briefly give some background about the case. We'll tell you about the Bangor project, give you a little bit of details about the Bangor project, which is really central to our case. Explain why we think the president is violating the law and our Constitution. You'll then, of course, hear from the governor, and then we'll be happy to take your questions. So as you all know, as a presidential candidate, Donald Trump repeatedly promised that he would build a wall if elected. He also promised, of course, that Mexico would pay for it. After he was elected, it became very clear that Mexico would not pay the United States to construct a wall on the southern border. Congress also refused to appropriate the billions of dollars necessary to build the wall, even when the president's party controlled both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So the president had a problem. He promised his supporters a wall, but Congress was refusing to appropriate the money that he needed. He threatened for months to declare a national emergency to secure the funding, using it as a negotiating tactic, an unusual approach when there's an actual emergency. Congress did ultimately approve $1.3 billion to fund the border wall project, but that was far less than the $5.7 billion the president had asked for. Consequently, in February of this year, the president declared a, quote, national emergency to reallocate even more funding. Congress voted in a bipartisan fashion to overturn President Trump's emergency declaration. At the time, a U.S. Senator, Lamar Alexander, a Republican from Tennessee, had the following to say, which I think sums it up pretty well. We had a war against a king in the American Revolution. This would be the first time that a president has ever asked for a certain amount of money from Congress. Congress has refused to provide it, and then the president has declared a national emergency under the 1976 Act and said, I'm going to spend the money anyway. President Trump responded by issuing the first veto of his presidency. The bottom line is that President Trump's emergency declaration is an illegal end around Congress. During the press conference announcing the declaration, the president acknowledged that it wasn't a real emergency. He said, quote, I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I did not need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster. The administration then announced a plan to divert more than $6 billion in additional money for the wall from other funds already allocated within the federal budget. This included more than $3.6 billion from the congressionally approved military construction budget you often hear referred to as the MILCON budget, the military construction budget. However, the administration at that time did not say what specific projects would be impacted from that military construction budget. In other words, there was no clear evidence at that time that Washington State specifically would be harmed by this constitutional battle going on about the wall and Congress's power over the purse. That changed earlier this month when the Trump administration identified specific military construction projects that it plans to raid and has raided in order to build President Trump's wall. By the way, that's almost 7 months after declaring the emergency, as now he's identified those projects. That is when we learned that Washington projects would be impacted. Specifically, the president's plan will take $89 million meant to build a critical new pier, maintenance facility, and fueling station at the Bangor submarine base. You don't have to take my word for it. The Department of Defense itself wrote at length about how crucial these projects were when they made their funding request to Congress, right? When they made their funding request to the Department of Defense. They had to explain why they needed this money. Bangor, of course, as you know, is home to the U.S. Pacific Fleet of Trident ballistic missile submarines. Part of Bangor's critical operational mission is to provide a security escort for submarines moving between the base and dive points in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. When there is no space at the existing pier, sailors are subject, this is what they wrote when asking for the funds, sailors are subject to, quote, extensive berth shifts and unnecessary days spent away from home port. That means that in the Department of Defense's own words, President Trump's actions will harm sailors and their families. So this is the Department of Defense asking for these funds, and the reason we need it is to avoid these extensive shifts and unnecessary days spent away from home port with sailors. They went on to say that if the pier is not provided, quote, full operational capability of the transit protection mission cannot be executed. Nuclear weapon security posture will continue to fall short of DoD directives and requirements. In plain language, this means that eliminating the Bangor project will negatively impact military readiness. That is also at stake with the loss of this project, the funding for this project. Additionally, failing to build the new fueling stations means Washingtonians will continue to face serious environmental risk from what the DoD describes as, quote, a converted fuel system that was designed for temporary use. Refueling from a barge, which is what the Navy is currently forced to do, increases the risk of an oil spill into Puget Sound. President Trump can't get the funding he wants from Congress, so he's putting Washington at risk to pay for that wall. I'll be brief about our arguments. We're happy to take more questions, but there are three key arguments in this case. Two involve violations of federal law, and a third involve a constitutional claim. Just at a high level, often when we bring these cases, we have two buckets of claims, statutory claims, in other words, saying, hey, the administration is violating federal laws. The other bucket are constitutional claims. And so just breaking those down, I'll start with our statutory claims, in other words, violations of federal law. The way, in fact, we've won most of our cases against the administration is over statutory violations. First, the statute that the president is relying on, 10 U.S.C. 2808, Section 2808, is very specific. It says this money must be sent to military construction projects. And if you move military construction funds, they must, under the statute, go to another military construction project. That's how the statute's written. It's limited in that way, in a very specific way. The problem for the Trump administration is that the border wall is not a military construction project in the manner contemplated by that statute. The statute anticipates a situation when our country has to go to war and swiftly deploys our military, needs to build installations and get the resources to support our military in defending our country. That's what the statute's all about. When there's an emergency and Congress doesn't have the time to legislate, this section, Section 2808, gives the president flexibility to build things like bases and barracks. That's not what this is. Because the border wall does not meet the definition of a military construction project, the president's transfer of the Bangor funds is unlawful. The second statutory problem is the emergency declaration itself. President Trump's emergency declaration violates the statute by granting him the power to declare emergencies and thereby access certain emergency powers, because the president has the authority to declare a national emergency, as the Senate put it, only when emergencies actually exist. For the sake of comparison, only 2 other domestic incidents have been declared emergencies, national emergencies: the H1N1 flu pandemic and the September 11th terrorist attacks. When the president himself says he, quote, doesn't need to do this, then waits 7 months to actually specify where the funding is coming from, we believe it'll be very difficult for the administration to prove to a federal judge and make the case that he declared a national emergency in good faith. The evidence belies that assertion. Finally, third, in addition to those statutory claims that we have, the constitutional issues raised by President Trump's actions are obvious and serious and have been well documented in the press. The emergency declaration and the subsequent diversion of congressionally appropriated funding violates Articles 1 and 2 of the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution, as you all know, gives Congress the authority to make legislation and appropriations, not the president. The president is abusing his authority in violation of the Constitution. We are filing this action today to stop President Trump from doing an end around Congress by diverting funds allocated for a specific, important project here in Washington State. Just as one more additional note before I turn over to the governor, we intend to file an additional motion for injunctive relief. That will not be filed today, but will be filed soon. So we, of course, will keep you posted on that. And so now I'm going to invite Governor Inslee, who in addition to being governor, used to be a member of Congress and has some personal knowledge about the power that Congress has when it comes to issues like this. So Governor Inslee, thank you so much for being here and look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Let me get that out of your way. Yeah. I want to thank Bob and his whole team for their exemplary work they've been doing for the last couple of years. Bob is now 21-0. He's beat the Trump administration 21 times in a row. He's pretty humble, so he doesn't want to talk about that. But we're very proud of his work. And it has been repetitive, and people ask, you know, if they ask Bob, when are you going to stop suing the Trump administration? Well, we ask, when does the Trump administration stop stealing money from the state of Washington and reducing our authority to protect our people? We are here today to protect the proud Washington State sailors and their families who are protecting our security against the depredations of a rogue president who is reducing our security. Make no mistake about it. What he is doing here is reducing our national security. Look, this is personal in a sense for me. I live over in Kitsap County. I see these subs going by with dozens of nuclear-tipped missiles, and they need to be protected from threats, including terrorism, by the sailors who run these protection escort vessels. And they have to have a place to dock and be maintained, and that's why this Maritime Protection Unit and why the Pentagon has concluded this vital to national security. And the situation here is the only real emergency here is the emergency of Donald Trump's poll numbers continuing to decline, because he continues these hijinks of reducing our ability to protect our people. So this is something that ought to be looked at as a personal affront to Washington State. We do need to build a wall. We need to build a wall to protect which we hold dear. We need to build a wall around the U.S. Constitution so it's not violated by Donald Trump. And we need to build a wall around our sailors to protect them in the performance of their duties. And that's what we're doing today with this lawsuit. So I want to thank everybody again on this team. The executive branch is supporting the AG in this regard. Our Department of Ecology has a role here because this is an environmental issue as well, to decrease the risk of oil spills, to make sure that this expenditure gets to be done. Now, there is a constitutional ramifications here as well. You cannot reiterate the threat that this poses to basic democracy today. When a president asks for Congress, Congress, including the Republican Party, says no, and he tries to move this end around the constitutional principles. And we will not let him get away with this today, otherwise he'll try to get away with it tomorrow. So I'll conclude with a Robert Frost poem in honor of Bob's father, who was a poet. And Frost said, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall," and that something is Washington State, because we love our sailors, and that's who we're protecting today. Thanks.
Thanks, Governor. And my late father, Murray Ferguson, was, I don't know if I shouldn't say he was a poet, but he appreciated wonderful poetry, including Robert Frost, so thank you for mentioning that. Hey, just a final thought, and then we'll take your questions, is I was asked quite a bit back in February why we were not one of the 20 states that filed a lawsuit at that time over the emergency declaration and the diverting of funds on the wall. The team had prepared a complaint at that time. We knew an emergency declaration might be coming, but when we took a look at the funds actually being used to pay for that wall, we did not see a harm to Washington State at that time. And I often say there are three key questions I ask the team before we file a lawsuit against the president. The questions are pretty straightforward. Do we have good legal arguments? Is there a harm to Washingtonians? And do I have standing as Attorney General to bring the lawsuit on behalf of the people, which is related to the harm issue? If there's a yes and a yes and a yes, then we file the lawsuit every time. If there's a no in there, then we don't. And my job is to be very disciplined about that. And so 20 states went forward, but I just felt there was not a identifiable harm to Washington State at that time, and so we waited. Now there is a very specific harm, and this is the type of thing that the team goes into federal courts and says to the judge, this is what the impact here is in Washington State. We think our legal arguments are very strong. We think the harm to Washington is abundantly clear, and we expect to win this case once again against the president. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll open up to your questions. If there are specific questions about the case, which we're happy to answer, the legal arguments, you may see me defer to Andrew Hughes from my team, and he'll do his best for the folks on the phone to identify himself when he comes up as well. Any questions that folks have, go right ahead.
The Supreme Court allowed the administration to use some of the Pentagon funding to build sections of the wall already. How does that court ruling factor into this?
Sure. So I'll just repeat the question for those who might be on the phone, but in essence the question went to, hey, the Supreme Court's weighed in on a case that was related to this issue, not involving Washington State, and how does that impact us here? I've had many conversations with the team about that, but on that one I will defer to Andrew to give a sort of a short summary of why that's an apples and oranges in terms of impacts to us. So Andrew, do you want to give a short summary of that?
Of course. Good morning. I'm Assistant Attorney General Andrew Hughes. The short answer to the question is that there are three buckets of money that this administration has targeted. We're focusing on the military construction funds, which is the third bucket of money. The Supreme Court stay order from July related to an entirely different bucket of money, an entirely different set of statutes, and an entirely different set of plaintiffs. So that ruling simply has no bearing on our lawsuit today.
Thanks.
Of course.
Other questions?
I had a question about I've seen these escort vessels run before, you've seen the Hood from the Hood Canal Bridge. Were they there, was that a result of 9/11 when the Navy started doing that? Does anybody know?
Do you know, Governor? Do you know, Andrew?
I'm not positive, but I believe there was an escort protocol before 9/11. I believe, but I'm not positive.
And I do not know the answer. We can do a little poking around on that, but I'm not aware of the, I don't want to get that wrong.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's fine.
you bet.
So I've got another question for the governor,
Yep.
because it's sort of related to this. You know, yesterday and today, the Trump administration is trying to end California's
Right.
emissions and other automotive. We follow that protocol. We're one of those other 12 states. Tomorrow, we're going to have this whole climate change walkout, etc. Give me your thoughts, because this is obviously a major, it's different from this, but it also has something in common in the sense that you've got administration that's going after the ability of states to declare their own environmental standards.
Well, unfortunately, this is a president who continually answers to the needs of his personal insecurity and his interest in his own vanity and his declining poll numbers, rather than allowing us in Washington State to protect our citizens. And yet this is another case. Today we're filing a lawsuit to protect our sailors so that they can protect us. And this is personal. These are nuclear-tipped missiles in these submarines that are off of our waters being protected. So this is personal for us who lives on the shores of Puget Sound. And it is personal on us that we ought to be able to have more efficient cars to drive. The existing law will essentially say that the federal law will make sure Washingtonians can have less cost to run your car. It's a sweet deal to have a car that gets more mileage. You save money. You also reduce carbon emissions and climate change gases, both. And yet the Trump administration, because he's in bed with the oil and gas industry, who want to force Washingtonians to buy more unnecessary gasoline, he's trying to strip us in Washington State of the ability of protecting our motorists to get more efficient cars. And it is an extremely enraging thing, first from the perspective we'd like to spend less money on our cars, but also because we have a climate crisis. In the middle of the climate crisis, we are the most scientifically literate state in the country. We understand what the climate crisis is doing to our state with forest fires and ocean acidification and the threat to the orcas because of increasing water temperatures. And here we have a fellow in D.C. trying to reduce our ability to protect ourselves. Message to Donald Trump: leave us do our job and we will protect Washington citizens, and keep your clutches off of our ability to do that. So we will be protecting at the right moment in court the ability for us to do that, and that'll happen, I predict, fairly quickly.
Is there any more news on the students? I know your desire was that they should be able to